Welcome, it's the Close the Deal Show. I'm your host, Terrence McCray, formerly incarcerated. Every week we bring you business information, tips, and insights from entrepreneurs, business professionals, and inspired individuals from the San Francisco Bay Area and beyond. The Close the Deal Show also features public announcements, Entrepreneur Week, and small business. And if you're looking for strategies to help you in business or educate the public, then you're in the right place. Thank you for joining us today. Today we have Sejal Thakkar on the show to talk about something that has taken America by storm for quite some time. When I think of the word sexual harassment, the first thing comes to mind is Anita Hill. We all remember that big scandal with Clarence Thomas, not Chief Justice, but United States Supreme Court Justice. And since Donald Trump has come into office, a lot of people in the public eye have been not only alleged, but have been lost from their job. And I mean lost from their job. I'm talking about they thought that they had an opportunity to take advantage of something that, a lot of people don't like to see happen. Excuse me. We're talking about sexual harassment, a very significant and important issue. So, Mr. Sejal Thakkar is here today to discuss this for small business owners as well as for corporate companies. So please welcome Mrs. Sejal Thakkar to the Close the Deal Show. How are you?
Hi, Terrence. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Absolutely. Could you please let the public know what is sexual harassment?
Sure, Terrence. Well, sexual harassment in California is defined as any kind of unwelcome sexual advance. And keep in mind that sexual harassment can be between two individuals of the same gender as well. There's a lot of different ways that sexual harassment can take place in the workplace. For example, it could be inappropriate touching. It could be something that somebody is displaying that's offensive to another person of a sexual nature. It could be something verbal, a comment that somebody makes. So there's lots of different forms that sexual harassment can take. And I agree with what you just said at the beginning, that this is a real big epidemic. It's a problem. And I'm glad that I can be here to share some education and some insight on what we should do about this problem that we're facing.
What are the different types of sexual harassment?
So, if you have a situation where there is a supervisor involved, there's a type of sexual harassment. There's basically two different kinds. One is called quid pro quo, and that's in Latin for this for that. And what that means is when a supervisor is demanding sexual favors in exchange for some benefit related to the employment. So, for example, I'll give you a promotion if I'm a supervisor, and I tell a subordinate, I'll give you a promotion if you go on dates with me or if you have sex with me, for example. That would be a situation of you do this for me and I'll do that for you.
Does that really happen in the workforce?
Oh, absolutely. Think about it, Terrence. When you're in a situation, a lot of the cases you mentioned actually at the beginning, people wonder, how can somebody get away with this for 20, 30 years and nobody's calling that person out? Well, it's simple. It's because the person is in a position of power. And so when somebody, as supervisor, is in a leadership position, people that work with that individual are likely to kind of be intimidated by that person and go along with whatever they want them to do. Now, oftentimes you're not going to see some supervisor saying, have sex with me and then I'll give you the promotion, right? It tends to be more indirect. It's one of those where, let's say I was going to give you a performance evaluation in a couple of weeks. And all of a sudden, we've never had any kind of social interactions together. But then all of a sudden I start saying, hey, Terrence, you want to go to a movie with me? Would you like to go get a glass of wine? It's been a rough day today. So I'm not really saying if you don't come with me, I'm not going to give you a good promotion or I'm not going to give you a good evaluation. But if you're in that position, you might be likely to go along with what I want just because you're intimidated, because your job depends on it, right?
So is that like manipulation?
It's intimidation. It's a power differential, and people are likely to feel intimidated. And don't get me wrong, we live in the Bay Area. It's expensive here. People need a paycheck. And so people are likely to go along with things that even if they're not agreeing with or they're offended by it, they might go along with it because they're scared they might lose their job if they don't.
So when you say scared to lose their job, what type of situations have you dealt with in your particular field where clients have come to you and brought up I'm being sexually aroused. What do you specifically look for to know that this is an actual case that has merit?
And that's a really good question. Depending on, so the first kind of sexual harassment I just told you about was quid pro quo. The second type is a hostile work environment case. And so the standard is there enough information for it to rise to the level of being a hostile work environment? And so there's a lot that goes into what we look at, and it's not black and white. It's not one situation is going to be a sexual harassment versus another. You really have to look at a lot of different factors, like how severe is the conduct? How pervasive is it? Is it likely to harm somebody or make it difficult for them to do their jobs? So the Supreme Court has set forward a lot of different factors that we look at, and that's what makes these cases so hard. And so that's why I'm a strong proponent that we need to have employers focus in and create a culture not just to prevent sexual harassment, but really promote a culture of dignity and respect. And so if you create that kind of culture where there's going to be a zero tolerance for sexual harassment or any kind of harassment, right? It could be harassment based on age, based on race, based on color. If the company really wants to prevent sexual harassment, I think they have to start focusing on prevention. And that starts by looking at the culture and saying, we want to promote respect in the workplace.
Well, what about a small business that has 10 employees? Like right here in San Francisco, they have so many mom and pop type small businesses, whether it's retail or whether it's food industry. Mm-hmm. How do you reach out to those specific small businesses, unlike Google or LinkedIn, or Facebook? Those type of companies, I'm quite sure, have trainers.
Yeah.
How do you reach out to those local small businesses?
And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to come on your show, is to educate the smaller employers, because, up until this year, the law was that you only had to, if you had more than 50 employees, you had to just train your supervisors on sexual harassment every couple of years. But in January, a new law went into effect that is really requiring that if you have more than 5 employees, you have to train not just your supervisors, but all of your employees on sexual harassment, and you have to do it by the end of this year. So I'm reaching out by joining a lot of chambers, going out and doing public speaking, and really my efforts are focused in on the smaller employers, because those are the ones that I'm worried don't know about the new law changes.
Well, what about nonprofit organizations? People say they're in the business for not making money, but they also are in the business for profiting in order to keep the nonprofit organization running.
Sure. They're also bound by this new law, and again, a lot of people that are attorneys in my situation or trainers. I mean, we're doing a lot on LinkedIn and a lot of public speaking, but the more word we can get out there, the better. And again, I think it's the smaller employers that are really susceptible and vulnerable to not being in compliance, because you have a short window of time. I mean, if you think about it, we're already almost in July, and
Correct.
They have till the end of this year to get into compliance.
So is there a penalty if they're not in compliance? And how does one, like say for instance, if a person wanted to get a side job and they're already working a full-time job, but they get a side job at a restaurant and they feel like that they're being harassed and the supervisor overlooks their issue, how would they be able to address that complaint?
Well, and that's the whole point, right? I mean, we really have to, when we're talking about these employers, it has to start with the management on top, right? So the leadership has to be committed to creating a culture where there's going to be no harassment. And so in order to do that is not only they have to be committed, but they have to hold everybody accountable at all levels. So there has to be a shared responsibility. And then on top of that, you have to have the proper policies, you have to have the complaint procedures in place, and they have to be enforced. Right? So it has to be part of a holistic approach. But in the example that you just gave, it doesn't matter if the employee is working part-time or if they're an independent contractor or whatnot. That employee is still protected by the California state law, which is our Fair Employment and Housing Act. So even if a customer were to go to a restaurant and they felt like they were being harassed or discriminated against based on their sex, they have rights under our California law.
Are you saying if I'm sitting in a restaurant and a woman or a male were sexually inappropriate with gestures towards me, that I could actually file sexual harassment against the employee?
So let's put it this way. Let's say you were at a restaurant and a waiter at the restaurant came up to you and made sexually offensive comments to you. Okay, and they could be based on your gender, okay, or it could be any category. Our state statute has 17 protected categories. So it is race, religion, color, sexual harassment, gender, sexual orientation. There are 17 different protected categories of people. And so if you were sitting at a restaurant and let's say the waiter was making inappropriate comments to you based on any one of those protected categories, you can file a complaint with that employer that the waiter is harassing you. And that also goes in reverse. So let's say you were making harassing comments to the waitress.
Okay.
She can also inform the employer, and the employer would have to do something to stop that behavior.
Well, it sounds like to me there's going to be a lot of lawsuits at Hooters.
We've already seen that already, and those are already being dealt with. But there are certain employers, Terrence, that are going to be provided different leniency, based on their culture that they have going on. But the law applies to everybody, big and small employers, and everybody has to follow the California law.
Well, what must we do to eradicate sexual harassment in the workplace?
Sure. I think, again, it starts with management. They have to be committed to creating a culture of and putting together and investing in their culture. Again, I think what's happened so far and why it hasn't worked, Terrence, as I've told you, is that I've litigated these types of cases in court. I've been practicing in just employment law since 2003. So I was actually in court litigating these types of cases. And in my opinion, it hasn't worked because a lot of employers, they wait for the lawsuit to be filed or a complaint. So they're not focusing on prevention. So the focus has to be on preventing these types of behaviors, not waiting for a lawsuit or a complaint because it's too late at that point. The other part of it also is leadership has to be creating an environment where people feel comfortable in making these kinds of complaints. If people in that organization are afraid that the company is going to retaliate against them or treat them differently or not take them seriously, they're not going to speak up about these kinds of concerns. And the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission just released their statistics. We saw in 2018 almost a 14% increase in sexual harassment complaints. So what's been going on, it hasn't been working. We got to do things differently. And so the one way to do that is make sure the training that's being provided to employees is effective. And so to do that, you have to include components on how to have a civil workplace. You've got to make people accountable at all levels. So you've got to offer some kind of bystander intervention training. So if you're an employee and you see somebody else is not being treated fairly or is being harassed, you have to feel comfortable in raising those concerns to management. We know that right now, 3 out of 4 individuals are not reporting these complaints. So we have to make sure that all employees are feeling inclusive and that they feel comfortable in raising these kinds of complaints.
So are you telling me that because a person may be in a situation, they don't want to come forward because they may feel there's a backlash?
Absolutely. 3 out of 4 people are not complaining. And there's a lot of different reasons why. Some people aren't going to complain because they don't think management's going to do anything about it. They don't trust management. Or some people aren't going to complain because they're afraid they're going to lose their job over it. There's 100 different reasons why people don't complain. One of the biggest reasons is because they don't believe leadership is serious about creating a culture where these things are going to be taken seriously.
So I want to go back to the word you used, prevention. And you mentioned that there were 17 categories under the law that protects someone facing harassment.
That's right.
One of the things that I find interesting is that you don't find too many lawsuits mentioning bias. Because when you create a culture of a workplace, some people may say, we want to limit on how many minorities we want to hire because I want to work with the guy that I went to college with. So how do you challenge those type of issues where a person is actually trying to get in and be the first minority to get in position, but they're being denied an opportunity?
Sure. And, I deal with this all the time, failure to hire complaints. And I've been doing a lot of training on unconscious bias. And we address bias at all levels of the organization, from the hiring all the way to the separation of the employment. And there's vulnerabilities at all of these processes. But to address your issue, I think that has to be a pretty big component of training all employees that how to become aware of their bias, because a lot of bias that people have is actually unconscious. You know, I read a statistic somewhere that we process close to 11 million bits of information, and only 50 or 60 pieces of that information is conscious. So we think we're living conscious lives, but a lot of it is happening unconsciously. So the first step is to become aware of your unconscious bias. Once you become aware of your unconscious bias, then we can take steps to mitigate that from impacting your decisions. So for example, in hiring, that's the example you mentioned. You know, there is a video on YouTube that I often show in my trainings where there was an employee, his name is Jose Zamora, and he's got great experience, great education, and he applied to 50 or 60 employers, and he didn't get any response. So he started wondering, wait a second, what's going on? And so what he did was, all he did, Terrence, was change his first name from Jose to Joe. Same resume, same employer. All these people that were looking at his resume had some kind of bias associated with with his first name.
Okay, sound like we. Oh. Hello, this is the Close the Deal show. Who might we speaking with?
Good evening. This is an executive leader in healthcare. I just have a question for Mrs. Thakkar.
Oh, yes, you do. Go ahead, right away.
Mrs. Thakkar, I am an executive leader, as I mentioned, for several healthcare facilities, and I have been for several years. We've always had a sexual harassment module that we had to complete annually in order to remain employed. My question to you is, what is the difference between what has always been a requirement versus what just was mandated in January 2019?
Sure, that's a great question. And you know what, the EEOC, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but they came out with a report in June of 2016 where they had a task force and they looked at the prior sexual harassment trainings and why they didn't work. And they issued a report. This report, by the way, is over 100 pages. And they made a lot of recommendations in there about how to make training better. And a lot of that is incorporated into where we are today. And so the training, what's changed now is now employers have to train everybody. But in order for the training to be effective, what you need to really consider is making sure the training is it's going to cover more than just what's required, right? So you want to make sure the training covers bystander intervention, that it covers more than what just the law requires, that it's going to cover behaviors that are not, maybe they don't rise to the level of being sexual harassment, but they address more of the uncivil behaviors. For example, rude comments, uncivil comments, making, bullying and abusive conduct is a part of the training, but really showing employees what they should do if they encounter certain types of behaviors rather than just what's required. Another key component is that the training has to be tailored to each employer. It can't just be a standard training for all employers because the makeup of your organization may be different than from somebody else. So we want to customize the training for your specific environment and address any kind of issues that you have within your organization. And so the other thing that went into effect in January is they also required that we specifically address in the sexual harassment trainings, abusive conduct and bullying was already a requirement, but now they added a component of making sure that the training addresses sexual orientation, gender expression, gender identity, and all of these areas that, may not have been so focused prior to this year. Now we have a specific mandate to make sure the training addresses those issues as well.
Wow, that sounds wonderful. My only other question is I would love to speak to you offline because currently I have a contract in place for all of my facilities, and there are several modules within that contracted vendor. I just wanted to make sure that that vendor is aware of all of these new mandates, and maybe I can email you, a list of the required classes, and you can just, do kind of a check off and let me know if we're in compliance.
Absolutely, definitely.
She will definitely provide her email information. We only have a couple minutes. She will definitely, you can go to her website right here, If you're watching, please tune to her website real quick. Could you indicate your website?
Sure, it's www.trainextra, and that's TrainXtra.com. And definitely feel free to reach out to me. All my information's on there. You can email me. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me there, and I always post about various public speakings that I'm doing, and I'd be more than happy to look over what you're required. You know, I'm biased. I think that live training is the way to go. I don't think that, you know, doing a webinar or online training is effective to meet all the requirements.
Perfect. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Sure, you too.
And thank you. Well, it sounds like you are definitely doing what you're supposed to be doing correctly. But I want to thank you for not only coming on this show, I want to thank you for educating the public in the information and how they can learn what sexual harassment is about and learn more and how to prevent it at the workforce.
Thank you so
as well
much.
as the workplace. Excuse me.
Thank you for this opportunity, Terrence. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Before we close this deal, we would love to hear from you. If you have suggestions, questions, or even want to apply to be a guest on the Close the Deal Show, go to www.theclosethedealshow.com. San Francisco Bay Areas. You can watch us every Monday night at 8:30 on cable Comcast Channel 29 locally in San Francisco. You can also find us worldwide on the YouTube channel. Just type my name, Terrence McCray, click my picture. Please subscribe, like your favorite comment. Take good care, everyone, and don't forget, find the right connection and close the deal. We got to get up out of here. Yep, we stopped it. We got somebody else.
All right.